That's the sound of a stick shaker. It's a warning designed to get the pilot's attention that they're about to stall, lose lift. And that's the warning the pilots of Lion Air Flight 610 got immediately as they took off, only they weren't stalling. The presence of the stick shaker is one of the revelations coming from the preliminary accident report into the Lion Air crash. And much of the analysis comes from what the airplane was telling them as recorded by a sophisticated flight data recorder, one of the plane's 2 black boxes and the only one recovered so far from the Java Sea. The plane thought it was in a stall because of bad information coming from a pair of these, the angle of attack sensors that were feeding conflicting information into a system unique to the MAX, called MCAS, which was designed to prevent the plane from stalling by making the horizontal stabilizer in the back of the plane move in a direction to bring the nose down. But the bad instrument data led to a battle between the pilots and the airplane itself. On the orange line, you can see how the MAX, thinking it was stalling, tried to push the nose down, and pilots on the blue line tried to pull the nose up. A cycle that went on dozens of times, the pilots repeatedly telling air traffic controllers they had a flight control problem. The pilots could have stopped their roller coaster ride by turning these 2 switches off. That's what happened on the previous flight the day before. Those pilots also went over the trim checklist and landed safely. But it appears the pilots aboard the plane's last flight didn't use a checklist, finally nosing over and heading toward the Java Sea. 31 seconds after their last tower transmission, the flight data recording stops. The investigation will next head to Seattle in the 737 MAX engineering simulator we showed you back in 2016. There they'll attempt to conduct exercises to better understand what happened and get us closer to answering the whys in this investigation. One piece of evidence divers found in the ocean are the angle of attack sensors, but a huge piece they haven't yet found is the cockpit voice recorder that will actually spell out the drama that was in that cockpit at that point. But there is a bigger story here beyond sort of that last flight. There were 3 days of maintenance that preceded this, were things, I mean, they had other instruments that were also going haywire on them. They were basically flying blind without being, except for being able to see out the window. They actually asked for airspace so they wouldn't potentially, they didn't know where they were in terms of their altitude. Wow. So there were a lot of other things going on here, but also the safety culture at Lion Air is also changing as well, because they went back and said that other crew that faced this got the problem resolved. That was a good thing. They said they should have gone back to the airport. They should not have completed that flight.
So, Glenn, does this address the issue of this new system unique to the MAX that pilots say they didn't say they knew it existed? They
didn't know it existed. We've talked to pilots from American and Southwest in particular. They're flying, among others, that are flying the MAX in the country. They say, now that we know, and this happens, we know exactly what to do. Kill those switches, go ahead and land the plane. But one of the other things that came up here on that previous flight is that checklist didn't say, cut the flight short, go ahead and land. So there's going to be some revisions coming out of this.
I think bottom line, people want to know, with so many of these planes in the pipeline, so many of these planes flying, are they safe, bottom line?
They're safe because now everybody knows. So if you have this, I mean, so much of what pilots go through is knowing, that's what they practice for. That's what the simulators are for, hours and hours and hours on that. Now that they know this, they can deal with it.
Glenn, thank you.
Yes, good morning, Belle. Yes, the Boeing 737 MAX 8. It's very new. It's just been around for a couple of years. It's the newest version of a model that's been around for decades. It's more fuel efficient, and above all, it's been a commercial success. Boeing has already delivered several hundred of the planes, and it's got some 5,000 on order. Now, the 737 is the kind of standard bearer of international passenger air travel. It's considered as one of the industry's most reliable. It's a single-aisle passenger jet, and its direct rival is the Airbus A320. Now, the investigation here will be led by the Ethiopians. It's backed up by Boeing experts, and Boeing has issued a statement this morning saying its investigation is in the early stages, but there's no need for any new guidance to operators. Now, the safety concerns have led Ethiopian Airlines and the Chinese authorities to order the grounding of of fleets of these planes. But the US in particular says it has no plans to follow suit, and various other airlines have been issuing statements saying they're carrying on as normal for now.
Of course, the Lion Air crash that happened back in October was with the same type of aircraft. What similarities are there between the two? Yes,
well, at first sight, there are a lot of similarities between the two crashes. The same new plane. Both crashes happened soon after takeoff, and the problems occurred while the plane was ascending. Both reported odd flight patterns, and in both cases, pilots reported difficulties and asked to return to base. But there's no hard evidence of a direct link. In Lion Air's case, questions have been focusing on this automated anti-stalling system, but analysts say it's wrong to draw a direct link at this stage, especially before the black boxes have been recovered. You can't discount, for instance, other technical problems or human error. Lion Air also had a very poor safety record, whereas Ethiopian Airlines has a good record. The cause of the Lion Air crash is still being investigated. The investigators have said that pilots seem to struggle with this automatic anti-stalling system that when put the plane seemingly into a nosedive, and their efforts to correct it simply were overridden by this automatic system. There's a preliminary report that came out in November that gave no official cause. It focused on airline maintenance and training. The full report is due out later this year.
For more on this, let's bring in Stephen Wallace. He's the former FAA Director of Accident Investigation, and he is with us now from Washington. Thanks so much for being with us, Stephen.
Thank you.
It is rare, as people know, for passenger planes to crash. Ethiopian Airlines was considered one of the world-class airlines by everyone, not just in Africa, but around the world. Very strong safety record. Based on your experience, what should the focus of the investigation be to determine the exact cause of the crash?
Well, you're correct about Ethiopian Airlines it was basically started with a great deal of help in the 1960s by Trans World Airlines, went over there and helped them set it up. So it is certainly a well-respected airline. So early in the investigation, everything is on the table. We have recovered both recorders, the late model airplane with absolutely top-of-the-line flight data recorders, which would record hundreds of parameters, and cockpit voice recorders. So they have very good evidence. Interesting to note, one fact is that the wreckage was described as being in an area the size of a basketball court. Well, that would certainly tell you that the airplane came in probably nearly vertically. But everything's on the table on day one, and the best experts in the world are on their way to assist the Ethiopian government.
You know, when we heard about this crash and we heard that the plane was a Boeing 737 MAX 8, everyone thought of Lion Air and the disaster that happened there, and whether or not this type of plane is safe. What do we know about this plane so far?
Well, with an impeccable safety record, and then we had the Lion Air accident, where they have a very good idea what happened there with an angle of attack sensor and this modification to the 737 MAX series that where there's a control law change where the airplane can be pitched downward because of a tendency of the airplane, because of its larger and more forward engines, to pitch up in certain flight attitudes. So they know what happened and what could have prevented the accident with Lion Air. Now, investigators don't want to speculate or jump to conclusions, but they certainly have the Lion Air factual scenario in their minds, so there will be a hyper focus on that.
But, Stephen, this is a pretty new plane for Boeing. I mean, I don't know how these sort of things work. You know, Vlad, when you think about a brand new car coming out, sometimes you want to wait until the kinks are worked out. Mm-hmm. You know, is it the same for planes? I imagine that they would have to go through some sort of thorough testing before they start selling them to airlines.
Well, they absolutely do. Now, this airplane's been out for 2 years, but it's a variant of a 737 that's been out since 1967 with more than 10,000 out there. There are about 350 of these MAX models out already, but so when they make a new version of an airplane, the FAA aircraft certification people very tightly focus on anything that's new or changed. So this airplane went through a very thorough flight test program, and back when it was certified in 2017.
You know, Stephen, the 737, as our audience and you will very well be aware, is the workhorse of all of the world's major carriers. I mean, I think we've probably flown more 737s in our lifetime than any other aircraft. But I do wonder, as Anne-Marie was pointing out, with this 737 MAX 8 plane, the fact that they've had 2 major crashes in a very short period of time, it reminds me a bit of the Concorde crash back in 2000, I think it was, where that aircraft had never had a crash until then, and all of a sudden the safety record is now skewed because of that one crash. I mean, are we looking at the same thing here?
Well, I mean, I would point out that the Concorde there were just so few of them that the per departure accident rate went from being perfect to being the worst with one accident, because there were only about 16 of them operated as opposed to almost 11,000 737s. So they don't actually compare. But again, there was with Lion Air, there was something wrong with the airplane. It was also manageable if the correct procedure had been followed. So the world airlines learned from that. Certainly, they could see that, you know, it had what's called like a trim runaway, where there was just a selector switch to turn that system off and hand fly the airplane. That's Lion Air. Now, we should not jump to the conclusion that this accident was, you know, the same cause as Lion Air, but Lion Air is certainly in the minds of the investigators.
Yeah, no, your point is taken. I didn't mean to suggest of all the 737s. I just thought meant the 737 MAX 8s. So then I wonder then, are these pilots being trained? I know we've done several stories in the past where we go into simulators, flight simulators with pilots, and they replicate the conditions that caused a previous crash, and they watch the pilots go through the steps that are needed to be taken to prevent a fatality or a crash. What's happening with these other pilots in these other countries? Are they going through that training that Boeing provides?
I would certainly think so. And training is now done virtually 100% in simulators, because they simulate the airplane perfectly, and you can put the pilots into scenarios that would be extremely dangerous in an actual airplane, but you can do it safely in a simulator. So you're correct. I certainly believe that the world's developed airlines and these 737 MAXs really aren't being flown by anything other than developed airlines, and so simulator training with full motion visual simulators, I mean, that is a huge boon to safety, and I would certainly expect that airlines would have trained on this scenario, just as they taught pilots to fly through wind shear. We used to have wind shear accidents. We haven't had one in decades, because pilots were taught to fly airplanes in ways that they normally never would. Firewall the engines, pitch them up high, and things that, invaluable training that would be too dangerous to do in the airplane. So the short answer to your question is yes, I certainly would expect that this exact scenario would be run through in training programs.
Well, that's pretty good. I think a lot of people are thinking about their summer vacations and planning and wondering what plane are they going to be on.
It's just normal human reaction. You're like, wow, this plane, 2 accidents in a couple of months. I'm a little worried. Even though I know statistically they shouldn't be.
Right. Steve Wallace, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Indonesian investigators have reviewed the flight data recorder, and they say that black box indicates the same plane experienced similar problems with a new automatic safety system in the days before the crash. The other pilots managed to land safely. The 737 MAX is Boeing's latest high-tech passenger jet. It is selling fast around the world, so understanding why this brand-new plane crashed in Indonesia is a high priority for investigators. Crash investigators who've recovered the flight data recorder say it tells the story of 11 minutes of terror as the pilots of Lion Air Flight 610 fought a tug-of-war battle with the plane's computer to keep the plane in the air. Up and down more than 24 times. The plane's computer pushing the nose down towards the ocean, the pilots fighting to pull the nose up. Finally losing the battle as the plane slammed into the ocean at 450 miles per hour. But the pilots may not have known their brand new 737 MAX had a new automated trim system called MCAS. U.S. airlines say Boeing never flagged the safety system, which forces the nose down to avoid a potential stall, even when the plane is being flown manually. Investigators believe MCAS may have been activated after receiving bad data from its sensors or onboard computers.
That altitude from 6,000 to the ground is very short, so you need to do something immediately.
Veteran 737 pilot Ross Amer showed us the system can be disabled by simply flipping two switches. Waiting too long can be deadly.
I'm in a nosedive. Airplane is basically out of control, going through 340 knots towards the water directly.
Airspeed, altitude.
In a press conference overnight, Indonesian investigators reported that the aircraft in question experienced similar issues the day before the fatal crash. And that crew continued on to their destination after shutting down the anti-stall system. Authorities saying, quote, "We think what happened was that the plane was unfit for flying." In a statement this morning, Boeing says, in part, safety is a core value for everyone at Boeing, and that passengers have our assurance that the 737 MAX is as safe as any airplane that has ever flown the skies. Lion Air is also under scrutiny for allowing the plane to fly, despite those previous pilots reporting that they, too, had problems. Investigators have not yet recovered the other black box, the cockpit voice recorder. Meanwhile, airlines that fly the 737 MAX have spent the last few weeks under direction from the FAA, reminding pilots how to disable MCAS in the event that this happens again. About 45 are flown in the U.S. right now by various airlines. Guys, back to you.
All right. Tom Costello for us there in Washington. Tom, thank you.
Kata Bang Andrew nggak usah, momen soalnya.